If you're over 60 and watching your hair thin faster each year, there is one common habit many women practice daily, often believing it's harmless or even helpful, that quietly accelerates hair loss after menopause. In clinical practice, this habit rarely acts alone, but it often triggers a cascade of biological changes that disconnect nourishment circulation and hormonal signaling to the scalp long before shedding becomes impossible to ignore. My name is Dr. Eliza Hart, a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist with over 15 years of experience in women's health and hormonal wellness. The habit mentioned in the title is not something extreme or unusual. It is a routine many women over 60 practice daily, often believing it supports hair health, while in reality it quietly interferes with circulation, hormone signaling, and nutrient delivery to the scalp after menopause. At this stage of life, hair loss is rarely caused by age alone. It develops when biological changes meet repeated daily behaviors that the body can no longer tolerate in the same way. In this video, I'll explain how that common habit fits into a larger biological pattern that accelerates thinning, and why addressing the root mechanisms matters far more than chasing surface solutions. If this information is helpful, please subscribe for science-based guidance on senior women's health and leave a comment telling me which country you're watching from so I can see how widely this message is reaching. Be sure to watch until the end because I have a small but important insight that brings everything together. Now let's begin with the first biological factor contributing to accelerated hair loss after 60. 1. Protein deficiency. After 60, hair follicles are being starved. One of the most overlooked reasons hair begins to thin rapidly after 60 is not a dramatic illness or a sudden deficiency, but a slow biological shift that quietly changes how the body handles nourishment. Many women believe that as long as they are eating regularly and maintaining a balanced diet, their hair follicles will continue to receive what they need. In reality, aging physiology alters protein digestion, transport, and cellular uptake in ways that are rarely discussed, yet deeply consequential for hair integrity and long-term follicular resilience. From a clinical and nutritional standpoint, protein is not merely a dietary component, but the structural foundation of hair itself. Keratin synthesis depends on a consistent supply of specific amino acids, and after menopause, the body's ability to extract and distribute those building blocks declines. Reduced gastric acid production limits protein breakdown, while slower metabolic signaling delays delivery to peripheral tissues, like the scalp, particularly during periods of stress or caloric restriction. When this happens, hair follicles do not fail suddenly. They adapt by conserving energy, shortening their growth phase, and producing finer strands that are far more vulnerable to breakage. In practice, I often see women in their early 60s who made thoughtful lifestyle changes years earlier, cutting back on animal protein to manage weight or cardiovascular concerns. On paper, their diets appear healthy, yet their follicles tell a different story. When protein intake falls below the threshold needed for tissue repair, the body redirects available amino acids toward organs essential for survival, leaving hair follicles undernourished by design. This biological prioritization explains why hair loss often progresses even when overall health markers seem stable. A consistent pattern emerges when intake is corrected gradually and distributed evenly throughout the day rather than concentrated in a single meal. Within 6 to 8 weeks, many women notice reduced shedding and improved hair texture, not because growth has accelerated, but because follicles are no longer operating in a state of metabolic scarcity. Aging metabolism responds poorly to nutritional extremes, and hair follicles in particular require steady biochemical reassurance rather than intermittent abundance. What makes protein deficiency particularly misleading is that standard laboratory markers often remain within normal ranges, masking functional insufficiency at the follicular level. As digestive efficiency declines with age, absorption becomes just as critical as intake, and even adequate diets may fail to meet tissue-level demands. When weakened hair structure then encounters daily grooming practices or hormonal shifts, cumulative damage accelerates quietly. This is where nourishment alone becomes insufficient, and where external behaviors begin to exert a far greater influence on hair loss than most women realize. 2. Overwashing and heat styling, breaking hair faster than it can grow. What surprises many women after 60 is not how quickly hair begins to thin, but how fragile it becomes under routines that once caused no harm at all. Practices that felt normal for decades, such as daily washing, frequent blow-drying, or regular heat styling, can suddenly turn into silent accelerators of hair loss once the biology of the scalp changes. This shift is subtle, yet its impact on hair integrity is profound and often mistaken for inevitable aging rather than a modifiable process. After menopause, the scalp produces significantly less sebum, the natural lipid layer responsible for protecting hair fibers and maintaining flexibility. This decline is closely linked to reduced estrogen signaling, which affects oil production, skin hydration, and barrier repair. With fewer lipids available, the cuticle becomes less cohesive, allowing moisture to escape more easily and leaving hair fibers increasingly vulnerable to friction tension and environmental stress. Because barrier recovery also slows with age, repeated stripping prevents the scalp from fully restoring itself between washes. When hair is washed too frequently, especially with harsh cleansing agents, this already limited protective layer is stripped away repeatedly, compounding structural weakness over time. Heat exposure further magnifies this vulnerability. From a structural standpoint, hair fibers weaken with age as collagen support around the follicle declines, and internal moisture balance becomes harder to maintain. When high temperatures are applied, water trapped within the hair shaft rapidly expands, creating microscopic fractures along the fiber. Repeated exposure prevents these micro-injuries from sealing, gradually reducing tensile strength and elasticity. Over time, these fractures accumulate and hair begins to break along the mid-shaft rather than shedding naturally from the root. In clinical settings, I often encounter women who report fewer hairs in the drain, but notice that their hair never seems to regain thickness or length. When we review their routines closely, daily washing and frequent heat exposure are almost always present even when products are labeled as gentle or restorative. Once these habits are adjusted gradually, with longer intervals between washes and reduced reliance on high-heat tools, visible breakage often decreases within a matter of weeks. This improvement reflects preservation of existing hair rather than stimulation of new growth, a distinction that becomes increasingly important after 60. What makes overwashing and heat styling particularly damaging is how they interact with other biological stressors already discussed. Undernourished follicles and weakened hair fibers lack the resilience to tolerate repeated physical stress, and when external damage accumulates faster than age-slowed repair mechanisms can compensate, hair loss accelerates quietly, setting the stage for deeper disruptions that extend well beyond the surface of the scalp. 3. Undiagnosed thyroid imbalance, the silent hair cycle disruptor. What makes thyroid-related hair loss particularly dangerous after 60 is not how dramatic it looks at first, but how easily it hides in plain sight. Many women notice increasing fatigue, subtle weight changes, or thinning hair, and are reassured that these shifts are simply part of aging or the long aftermath of menopause. Yet beneath these vague explanations, the thyroid may already be altering the biological rhythm that governs whether hair grows, rests, or quietly disappears. From a medical standpoint, thyroid hormones act as metabolic conductors for nearly every tissue in the body, including hair follicles. They regulate how quickly cells divide, how long follicles remain in the active growth phase, and how efficiently nutrients are converted into structural proteins. After 60, the incidence of thyroid dysfunction rises sharply, yet diagnosis often lags behind reality. Standard screening frequently relies on a single marker thyroid-stimulating hormone, which can appear normal even when cellular signaling is already compromised. When thyroid output begins to drift downward, hair follicles are among the first tissues to respond. The growth phase shortens. The resting phase lengthens, and fewer follicles re-enter active production at the same time. Hair does not fall out in patches or clumps. Instead, density thins gradually across the scalp, giving the impression that hair is aging rather than malfunctioning. In cases of subtle hyperthyroidism, the opposite problem occurs as follicles are pushed through the cycle too quickly, shedding strands before they fully mature. In clinical practice, I frequently encounter women who were told their thyroid tests were reassuring, despite years of progressive thinning. When more comprehensive panels are reviewed, including free T3, free T4, and thyroid antibodies, imbalances often become clear. Once appropriate treatment restores hormonal signaling, many women notice not only improved energy and temperature regulation, but also a gradual normalization of shedding patterns over the following months. This response reflects a correction of biological timing, not a cosmetic intervention. What complicates thyroid-related hair loss is its interaction with other age-related changes already discussed. Protein intake may be adequate yet improperly utilized. Circulation may deliver nutrients efficiently, yet follicles fail to respond. In these situations, hair loss persists, not because support is absent, but because the internal command system is misfiring. Until thyroid balance is restored, external adjustments often yield disappointing results. This is why thyroid imbalance represents more than a hidden diagnosis. It is a bottleneck that quietly undermines every other effort to preserve hair after menopause. And as we move forward, it becomes essential to examine how hormonal shifts, unique to postmenopausal women, further reshape this fragile biological landscape in ways that standard explanations often overlook. 4. Postmenopausal hormone shift. When estrogen withdrawal rewrites hair biology. What many women are never prepared for after menopause is not the end of estrogen itself, but the chain reaction its absence quietly sets in motion. Hair does not suddenly begin to thin because estrogen disappears overnight. Instead, follicles are gradually exposed to a very different hormonal environment, one in which protective signals fade and opposing forces gain influence without resistance. This transition is slow, but once it reaches a tipping point, hair density can change far more quickly than expected. From an endocrine perspective, estrogen plays a stabilizing role in the hair growth cycle. It helps prolong the active growth phase, supports scalp circulation, and maintains collagen and moisture around the follicle. When estrogen levels decline after menopause, these protective effects weaken, allowing androgens, particularly dihydrotestosterone, to exert a stronger influence. Every woman produces small amounts of androgens, but without sufficient estrogen to balance them, follicles become increasingly sensitive to their effects. The biological consequence of this imbalance is a process known as follicular miniaturization. Instead of producing a strong, full-diameter hair, affected follicles generate progressively finer strands with each cycle. Over time, some follicles become so reduced that visible hair no longer emerges at all. This pattern typically appears as widening of the part thinning across the crown or loss of density at the temples, while hair along the sides and back may remain relatively unchanged. Because shedding is gradual and diffuse, many women underestimate how advanced the process has already become. In clinical practice, I often see women who have optimized nutrition-adjusted hair care routines and even address thyroid function, yet continue to experience steady thinning. When hormonal status is evaluated, it becomes clear that follicular signaling is still operating under postmenopausal conditions that favor regression rather than renewal. When estrogen support is thoughtfully restored or androgen activity is appropriately moderated under medical guidance, the hair growth cycle often stabilizes. While regrowth may be modest, the progression of thinning can slow significantly, preserving existing density and improving hair quality over time. What makes postmenopausal hormone shifts particularly impactful is how they amplify vulnerabilities created by other factors. Weakened follicles from protein insufficiency or mechanical damage are far more likely to miniaturize under androgen dominance. In this environment, even small hormonal imbalances can have outsized effects, transforming manageable thinning into progressive loss if left unaddressed. Before we move on, I'd like to hear from you. If you've noticed your hair thinning more noticeably after menopause type 1 in the comments, if you feel your hair changed only slightly or stabilized type 0, your responses help reveal how common this experience truly is, and they guide which aspects deserve deeper discussion next. 5. Micronutrient deficiencies, when supplements don't work. What often confuses women after 60 is that hair loss can persist even when blood work appears reassuring and supplement routines are already in place. Many assume that if standard laboratory values fall within normal ranges, nutrient-related hair loss can be ruled out. Yet for aging hair follicles, adequacy on paper does not always translate into sufficiency at the tissue level, especially when absorption, transport, and cellular utilization are quietly declining. From a biological standpoint, hair follicles rely on a narrow group of micronutrients to sustain growth repair damage and maintain structural integrity. Iron, vitamin D, vitamin B12, zinc, and omega-3 fatty acids all play distinct but interconnected roles in follicular metabolism. After menopause, several age-related changes interfere with how these nutrients are handled. Reduced stomach acid limits mineral absorption, alterations in gut lining, permeability impair uptake, and commonly prescribed medications further deplete critical reserves. As a result, follicles may experience functional deficiency even when intake appears adequate. Iron provides a clear example of this disconnect. Ferritin levels that are considered acceptable for general health may still be insufficient for hair growth, which demands a higher threshold to support rapid cellular turnover. Similarly, vitamin D functions more like a hormone than a vitamin, influencing follicle cycling and immune regulation within the scalp. After 60, diminished skin synthesis and limited sun exposure often leave levels suboptimal, weakening follicular signaling without obvious systemic symptoms. B12 absorption also declines as intrinsic factor production decreases, reducing the availability of a nutrient essential for cellular energy and DNA synthesis. In clinical practice, I frequently see women who have tried popular hair supplements for months with little improvement, only to discover that a single overlooked deficiency was never addressed. When targeted testing reveals low ferritin or insufficient vitamin D, correcting those specific gaps often leads to reduced shedding and improved hair resilience over the following months. This response does not indicate accelerated growth, but rather restoration of the biochemical conditions required for follicles to function normally. What complicates micronutrient deficiency is the tendency to overcorrect without guidance. Excess zinc can interfere with copper balance, high-dose biotin can mask laboratory markers, and indiscriminate supplementation may create new imbalances while failing to resolve the original problem. Hair follicles respond best to precision, not abundance, particularly in an aging metabolic environment. As we consider the cumulative impact of nutrition, hormones, and daily habits, it becomes clear that deficiencies do not operate in isolation. When follicles are already stressed by hormonal shifts or mechanical damage, even subtle nutrient gaps can tip the balance from maintenance to decline. And this leads us to a factor many women rarely associate with hair health at all, yet one that determines whether nourishment and hormones ever reach the follicle in the first place. 6. Scalp circulation and chronic inflammation, the missing link. What most women never consider when addressing hair loss after 60 is whether the scalp itself is still capable of receiving and responding to support. Hair follicles do not exist in isolation. They depend on a constant flow of oxygen, nutrients, and signaling molecules delivered through a delicate microvascular network. When that circulation quietly declines, even the most carefully balanced nutrition and hormone strategies may fail to reach their target, leaving follicles metabolically isolated long before visible thinning accelerates. From a physiological perspective, estrogen plays a central role in maintaining peripheral blood flow and vascular flexibility. After menopause, reduced estrogen contributes to subtle but progressive narrowing of small blood vessels, particularly in peripheral tissues such as the scalp. At the same time, age-related endothelial dysfunction limits nitric oxide production, further restricting circulation and impairing vasodilation during periods of increased metabolic demand. As blood flow slows, follicles receive fewer amino acids, less oxygen, and weaker hormonal signals, impairing their ability to sustain the active growth phase. Chronic low-grade inflammation compounds this problem. Aging immune regulation becomes less precise, allowing inflammatory mediators to persist at levels that may not cause pain or redness, yet still disrupt follicular signaling. Inflammatory cytokines interfere with stem cell activation within the follicle and alter the extracellular matrix that supports hair growth, gradually reducing responsiveness to growth cues. Over time, this creates an environment in which follicles remain technically alive, but functionally dormant, unable to fully engage in regeneration. In clinical observation, this pattern often appears in women whose laboratory results are largely optimized, yet shedding continues and regrowth remains limited. Many report a consistently cool or sensitive scalp, intermittent itching, or heightened discomfort during stress, all subtle indicators of compromised circulation and inflammatory imbalance. When strategies that support vascular flow and reduce inflammatory burden are introduced, shedding frequently begins to stabilize within weeks, not because new hair is immediately produced, but because follicles are no longer operating under chronic metabolic strain. What makes impaired circulation and inflammation particularly influential is how they magnify every other vulnerability discussed so far. Protein may be adequate, yet poorly delivered. Micronutrients may be sufficient, yet underutilized. Hormonal balance may improve, yet signals fail to reach their destination. In this context, hair loss is not driven by absence, but by disconnection. Understanding this missing link reframes hair thinning after menopause as a systemic communication issue rather than a purely nutritional or hormonal one. And as we move forward, it becomes essential to recognize that individual biology determines how these factors interact, which is why approaches that work well for one woman may produce little change for another, even when the underlying problem appears the same. 7. Medical safety and individual differences. Why one method never fits all. One of the most frustrating moments for women navigating hair loss after 60 comes when they realize they have followed every recommendation carefully, yet the results remain inconsistent or disappointingly small. What often goes unspoken is that hair recovery at this stage is governed less by universal rules and more by individual biology, medical context, and the way an aging body responds to intervention. Without acknowledging these differences, even well-intentioned strategies can miss their mark. From a medical perspective, aging introduces layers of complexity that dramatically influence how hair follicles respond to treatment. Medication use becomes more common, and many drugs quietly interfere with nutrient absorption, hormone metabolism, or vascular signaling. Genetic variation and age-related changes in liver detoxification further alter how supplements and hormones are processed, increasing the likelihood of unexpected responses. Chronic conditions such as thyroid disease, autoimmune disorders, insulin resistance, or cardiovascular issues further shape the internal environment in which follicles operate. Two women of the same age following the same routine may experience entirely different outcomes simply because their physiological baselines are not the same. Safety also becomes a defining factor after menopause. Hormonal therapies, anti-androgen treatments, and high-dose supplements may be appropriate for some women, yet risky or ineffective for others. Iron supplementation, for example, can support hair growth when deficiency is present, but excess iron may increase oxidative stress when taken without confirmation. Similarly, vitamin D, zinc, and biotin can be beneficial within specific ranges, yet disruptive when used indiscriminately. Hair follicles thrive on balance, not intensity, and the margin for error narrows with age. In clinical practice, I often encounter women who arrive discouraged after trying popular protocols that worked well for someone else. Once their medical history, laboratory markers, and medication profiles are reviewed together, it becomes clear that the issue was never effort or compliance, but mismatch. When interventions are tailored to individual needs, rather than borrowed wholesale responses tend to stabilize even if progress remains gradual. What makes this principle essential is how easily safety concerns are overlooked in the pursuit of visible improvement. Hair loss can feel urgent and deeply personal, yet aggressive approaches often undermine the very systems follicles depend on for recovery. Respecting individual differences is not a limitation, but a protective strategy that preserves long-term scalp health while reducing unintended harm. Recognizing that no single method fits every woman reframes hair recovery as a process of alignment rather than correction. And once this perspective is established, it becomes easier to set realistic expectations about what improvement looks like, how long it takes, and which changes truly signal progress rather than temporary fluctuation. 8. The hair recovery timeline: what to expect and when to act. The most damaging misunderstanding women carry into hair recovery after 60 is the expectation of speed. Modern culture conditions us to look for immediate feedback, yet hair follicles operate on a biological clock that cannot be rushed without consequence. When improvement does not appear within weeks, many assume failure and abandon strategies that were only beginning to take effect beneath the surface. From a physiological standpoint, hair growth is governed by a cyclical process that naturally slows with age. After menopause, follicles spend longer periods in the resting phase before re-entering active growth, and cellular turnover within the scalp becomes less responsive to sudden change. Even when underlying causes are corrected, the follicle must first stabilize its internal environment, restore signaling balance, and reduce inflammatory stress before visible progress can occur. This stabilization phase is quiet and often invisible, yet it lays the groundwork for every measurable improvement that follows. Clinically, the earliest sign of improvement is rarely new growth. Instead, women typically notice a reduction in daily shedding as follicles exit survival mode and regain metabolic consistency. This shift often occurs within 4 to 6 weeks when interventions are properly aligned and maintained without interruption. Improved texture, strength, and elasticity tend to follow over the next several months, reflecting healthier hair fibers rather than increased density. True regrowth, when it occurs, is usually a later development emerging gradually as follicles complete full growth cycles under improved conditions. What complicates this timeline is the cumulative nature of damage discussed throughout this video. Hair weakened by years of protein insufficiency, mechanical stress, hormonal imbalance, or poor circulation requires time to rebuild structural integrity at both the follicular and fiber level. Expecting rapid reversal ignores the reality that repair must consistently outpace ongoing loss before visible change can be sustained over time. Consistency rather than intensity becomes the defining factor in long-term success. In practice, women who remain patient and methodical tend to experience the most reliable outcomes. They measure progress by trends rather than isolated moments, understanding that temporary fluctuations are part of biological recalibration rather than signs of failure. Those who continually change approaches in search of faster results often disrupt recovery before it can take hold. Understanding the hair recovery timeline reframes success not as a dramatic transformation, but as a gradual return to balance. When expectations align with physiology, confidence replaces frustration, and each small improvement becomes evidence that the system is responding. At this stage of life, progress is not about turning back time, but about allowing the body the time it needs to function well again. Hair loss after 60 is rarely the result of one mistake or one missing solution. As we've explored throughout this video, it develops when multiple biological systems begin to drift out of alignment, including nutrition, hormones, circulation, inflammation, and the way the aging body responds to daily habits. When these factors are addressed together rather than in isolation, hair follicles regain the conditions they need to function with stability instead of stress. The most important advice I can offer is this: focus on consistency, not intensity. Nourish your body steadily, respect your individual medical context, and allow time for biological repair to unfold at its natural pace. Hair recovery at this stage of life is not about chasing dramatic change, but about protecting what remains, improving quality, and creating an internal environment where further loss slows instead of accelerates. Small, well-aligned steps taken patiently often produce far more reliable results than aggressive approaches that promise speed. If you found this information helpful and feel this channel is supporting you in understanding your health more clearly, you're welcome to make a small donation to help keep this content growing and accessible to women around the world. Your support truly helps this work continue. Before you go, please like this video, share it with someone who may need it, and subscribe for more science-based guidance on senior women's health. Thank you so much for spending your time here and for taking an active role in caring for your body with knowledge and compassion.